could. We're at an inflection point in world history with this battle. After this is settled, however it's settled, if Ukraine succeeds in driving out Russia from its territories, if Ukraine fails and ends up as a rump state, if the West holds together or if the West comes apart, moving forward will be different. However this ends, this is a very, very significant moment in world history. And this is not about simply getting through the next election. It's not about avoiding political controversy at home. This is equivalent to the buildup of World War II and something even more frightening because of the presence of nuclear weapons and China. This brings me to my second point. It's not possible to choose between, are we going to face Russia or are we going to face China? The United States and the West are facing both Russia and China. Both powers disagree with the way the world is structured today.
Russia and China represent a challenge to U.S. hegemony since World War II via multipolar hegemony. Russia and China, based on everything I've researched, are fed up with what's called the unipolar rules-based world order, in which the U.S. deep state and its vassals, and there's a lot of them, decides the rules of this order arbitrarily and oftentimes via double standards and hypocrisy. There's numerous examples of this. Russia and China want to be treated as equal partners on the world stage rather than as subordinates.
Split it apart. They want to go back to an earlier era of power politics, of the 19th century. Each country has its sphere of influence, and great powers will joust, argue, and fight at the boundaries. We've worked assiduously through 2 world wars and the Cold War and the post-Cold War to put together a system in which we encourage the peaceful settlement of disputes. We have the United Nations international
what's
law.
Called old power politics, as Clark says. It's about new emerging multipolar politics, where on the international stage, the dominant powers work together equally to resolve the issues of the world. The current international system set up by the unipolar rules-based world order is biased and one-sided. Just look at the IMF, the World Bank. Look what WEF, World Economic Forum, is up to. Look at the International Criminal Court. Look at a lot of the UN, the biasm towards U.S.
All of that is challenged by Russia and China. So the idea that we can stabilize, just get this over with in Ukraine, just stop it there because the losses are so heavy. And let's look at China. That's not going to be a successful policy. Both are connected. Success in helping Ukraine defend its territorial integrity and regain its territorial integrity will translate into deterrence.
This notion of Ukraine territorial integrity, sovereignty, is not relevant. That's a distraction. What's going on in Ukraine is a proxy war. It's a geopolitical battleground by the U.S. deep state and NATO to attempt to weaken Russia, who they view as a rival competitor to their control of the world. That's it.
Failure in Ukraine will provide an opening for China to expand its territorial aspirations in Asia. It's that simple, but it's very hard to convey it, and even harder to put it into policy at this point. So how would we do it? Well, point
US
3.
Deep state, NATO failure in the Ukraine proxy will accelerate the collapse of NATO, which has turned into an aggressive military alliance. Also, the failure will move the world to the emerging multipolar world. It is ridiculous of Clark to assert that China has territorial aspirations in Asia. That's ridiculous. If you look at the history of China, it doesn't have an imperial past. Taiwan is part of China, the one China principle. The US has been trying to undermine China by arming and encouraging independence of the Taiwanese.
You can win a war through the application of decisive force against the enemy's center of gravity. General Petraeus was part of that operation brilliantly when he commanded the 3rd Infantry Division in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And we did strike Iraq's center of gravity, its armed forces, and shatter them with decisive force. Well, you can also win another way, through what we would call escalation dominance. In 1999, NATO achieved escalation dominance over Slobodan Milosevic's Serb military and its ethnic cleansing in Kosovo through a escalatory campaign of air strikes. We convinced Milosevic he couldn't win. And the final blow to Milosevic was when he was indicted for war crimes and knew that we were preparing or discussing about preparing a ground invasion of Kosovo to physically eject. At that point, Milosevic tossed in the towel. Well, we're not going to be able to succeed with escalation dominance here because we've already, at least superficially, tossed it out the window. We've said we want to be responsive to the battlefield. We want to be careful not to start World War III. We respect Putin's red lines. Nations in Europe are shaky. They're concerned. Germany's afraid. France is concerned. Eastern European nations know what's at risk here. But escalation dominance that could have been applied at the outset, we didn't do it. So what is the enemy center of gravity here that we're working against? It's Mr. Putin's mind. When he believes he cannot succeed, that's when this war will end, as General Petraeus said. That's it. That's the center of gravity, not tens of thousands of Russian troops dead. Now, for Ukraine, if Ukraine suffers a breakthrough, that breakthrough will undercut Western support and resolution. So Ukraine cannot afford battlefield failure. Russia can afford many battlefield casualties and failure as long as Putin believes he can ultimately succeed. What's emerged, you see, from the West, despite all the great work to hold NATO together, despite consensus building, despite the billions of dollars of military assistance provided to Ukraine, what's emerged is actually a policy of seeking to have a soft failure by both combatants. Russia couldn't succeed, couldn't move forward. It's blunted its force. Ukraine has bled out. It would like to regain Crimea, but it doesn't have the force to do it. And so let's go to the negotiating table. That's a policy that's unlikely to produce lasting success. The reason is Mr. Putin is determined to take Ukraine. He wants it. He wants it because he fears China in the long term. And without Ukraine, Russia is a rump state. It's a policy that's unlikely to work because the Ukrainians simply cannot politically, morally accept giving up their territory in a concession to aggression. And it's a policy that's short-sighted because what it says is that aggression is rewarded. So this idea of soft failure, being responsive to the battlefield, but being 2 steps behind what's needed for Ukraine to move forward, that's a losing policy. We've got to move past that. 4th point.
Russia is the largest country in the world geographically, It has more resources than it knows what to do with. It's ridiculous to assert that it has imperial aspirations for Ukraine's resources. That's ridiculous. The invasion of Iraq, which Clark refers to, was on completely false grounds. These alleged weapons of mass destruction, and that assault on that sovereign country, again, more hypocrisy of the rules-based order. Iraq was a sovereign country. Around 1 million civilians were slaughtered in that assault. Very sad. NATO aggression, which Clark refers to when he was the general of NATO for Europe, was atrocious. The bombing of Yugoslavia, again a sovereign country, resulted in its fragmentation. Double standards. Now they're standing up for Kosovo because they claim its sovereignty matter. You see the bias in the rules-based order. It's whatever they decide goes. And that's why we're at loggerheads now in the world with the emerging powers going on.
In moving past it, we've got to come at Mr. Putin from all angles.
It is absurd to assert that Putin wants Ukraine. That is absolutely ridiculous. Russia is not dependent on Ukraine. As I mentioned, it has more resources than it knows what to do with. What it's concerned about is its internal security, the security around it, and the potential threats around it.
I endorse everything that General Hillier and General Petraeus have said about the battlefield, near term, midterm, and long term. But it's not just war. It's not just military. It's all angles. It's economic. They need to be tightened sanctions. It's diplomatic. We need to be going after these nations that are sitting on the sidelines and helping them to understand what's at stake. It's legal. We need to be preparing and indicting Mr. Putin for war crimes. It's political in the sense that our leaders need to come to their publics and explain exactly what's at stake and why support for Ukraine to regain its territorial integrity is in our vital interest. And finally, it is military. We've got to give them the assistance they need. That's long-range weapon, more artillery, more ammunition, fighter aircraft, the long-range drones, and we've got to mobilize our industrial bases. We can't fight and survive the two challenge by doing business as
What
usual.
I realize is when the U.S. deep state and NATO believe they cannot keep up the charade of the Ukraine proxy war with Westerners, all the propaganda, when Westerners start to see through it and question, that's when we will see this proxy war end, though Russia will end on its own terms. As it's stated, it wants to demilitarize Ukraine, denazify it, and ultimately liberate the Russian-speaking areas that have lived in terror since the U.S. initiated a coup in Kiev in 2014.